What's up guys, it's Ioana here, founder and CEO of Supwell, and today I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is the prices of running shoes. Now, we've seen in the past year, affordable running shoes are $100, daily trainers are getting close to $200, and in race day shoes, we're getting scarily close to $300. So, why is that? To answer that question, I dug into the balance sheets of 3 of the biggest shoe manufacturers in the world, putting my MBA to good use to uncover what makes these running shoes so darn pricey. So first up, I looked at the income statements of Adidas, Nike, and ASICS. The income statement is a snapshot of a company's financial position, and it tells us where the money flowed in and flowed out throughout the year. On it, we can see their revenue, their cost of goods sold, and their sales and other general administrative expenses. Those are the 3 key factors that we honed in on to find how much money they're making from selling shoes and also where the money is going when they're investing it into the shoe development, marketing, sales, etc. So after analyzing those income statements, we found that there were 4 main factors that are influencing shoe prices. The first is materials and labor. The second is marketing and distribution. The third is research and development. And the fourth is the company's margin, which they retain as profit. Alright, let's dive into material and labor costs. So through our analysis, we find that material and labor costs make up 60% to 70% of the running shoes price. Input costs are far and away the biggest line item for these apparel companies. They need to pay to operate factories, employ workers, and also for the commodities that are going in as raw inputs to these goods, like the rubber, the cotton, etc. On the income statement, all of these expenses are lumped together as a line item called cost of goods sold. And we can see that this cost of goods sold is about 55 to 60% of revenue for these companies, and then 60 to 70% of their total expenses for the year. So using their total expenses as a proxy for how much it costs to produce shoes, we can assume that it's 60 to 70% of the shoe's price going to these cost of goods sold, which is materials and labor. Now, Adidas spent $14.3 billion on cost of goods sold in 2022, which was 58% of their revenue. ASICS spent $1.8 billion on cost of goods sold in 2022, which was 53% of their revenue. And Nike spent $25.2 billion on cost of goods sold in 2022, which was 54% of their revenue. So for a real life example, if you're buying an ASICS Superblast for $200, that means $120 to $140 of that shoe's sales price is likely attributed to their cost of goods sold, which is the materials and the labor that go into producing the shoe. Alright, next up, we have the marketing, distribution, and operational expenses, which make up 20% to 30% of a shoe's price. There's no sale without getting the word out. We know that. That's why marketing is so important. And on the income statement, we see marketing expenses lumped under a line item called sales, general, and administrative expenses, also known as SG&A. Now, marketing expenses aren't broken out independently. They're going to be bucketed in that larger category. We can use this category to understand how much a company spent on marketing, on sales, on distribution, and all of those other operational expenses that do not directly go into producing the shoe, but rather bringing it to market. So firms in this industry generally spend about 40% of their annual revenue on SG&A expenses each year, which for Adidas was $9.7 billion, for ASICS was $1.3 billion, and for Nike was $14.8 billion. Now, what's interesting to note here was that Adidas and ASICS spent 40% and 39% of their revenue on SG&A expenses. Nike only spent 32% of their revenue on SG&A expenses. So we'll see that show up later on in how much Nike gets to retain for margin. Third, we have research and development costs. These companies put themselves on an annual treadmill where each year they're committing to coming out with the next version of the shoe. For example, you have the Nike Pegasus. It's been going for 40 years long. You do not get to the Nike Pegasus 40 without 39 years of development, but consumers are now also expecting innovations each year, which is a tough expectation to meet. Nike does not disclose their research and development costs, but for the other 2 companies, we see that Adidas spent $150 $150 million on R&D in 2022, and ASICS spent $34 million on R&D in 2022. Now, that only represents about 1% of those companies' revenue, but it is a large chunk of change still dedicated to developing these products and bringing the next great foam or next great upper construction to the market. So for that ASIC Super Blast that costs $200, you might have $1 to $3 of that going toward R&D expenses. Now, finally, we have the margin. This is the company's profit that they apply on top of what it takes to break even from selling a shoe. And we see that this makes up anywhere from 7% to 20% of a shoe's price. We'd all love for these running shoe companies to be benevolent purveyors of the fastest footwear, but they do have businesses to operate, they do have shareholders, so they apply a margin to get some profit, which they can invest back into the business or take to stuff their own fat tiger pockets. So across the three companies that we analyzed, the average margin, and this is for their entire business, keep in mind, not just for their running shoe lines, but their average margin was 12.2%. And the way we got to that figure was we divided EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, by their total revenue. So for Adidas, we see a 7.8% margin. They had $2 billion of EBITDA in 2022 and $24.6 billion of revenue. For ASICS, we see a 10.3% margin. They had $349 billion of EBITDA and a $3.3 billion revenue figure. And Nike finally had a monstrous 18.4% margin. And now, like I said before, that's because their SG&A expenses were way lower relative to these other two companies. They were sitting at 32% of their revenue attributed to SG&A versus 39% and 40% for Adidas and ASICS. So Nike made $7.4 billion in EBITDA and $40.7 billion revenue. So for a real life example, in that ASIC Super Blast, we're gonna see $14 to $40 of the purchase price of $200 going to the company's margin. So I hope this was helpful, guys, to help explain why every time we're buying a $250 shoe, while it feels like we might be getting ripped off, we probably aren't. They have businesses to run, marketing expenses, SG&A expenses, all the costs of goods sold from the raw materials and the labor. Let me know in the comments if you want to see more analysis like this, if you have any questions on how I dug into these income statements, and thank you for following along on the journey.